He was just a quiet black soldier sitting in his assigned first-class seat until the flight attendant slapped him in front of everyone. But 5 minutes later, he stood up, walked to the cockpit, and what happened next grounded the entire plane. Stay with this video because what this soldier does next will leave you stunned. And the truth, it was already written in the silence. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss one. The gate area near Gate 18 was crowded, but no one missed the tall man in uniform standing near the corner. His name was Terrence Blake, and he stood straight with his shoulders squared, wearing a clean army uniform and a calm, unreadable face. His boots were polished, his movements quiet. A black backpack hung from his shoulder, and when the boarding agent scanned his first-class ticket, he gave a small nod and walked onto the plane without a word. Seat 1A was right up front wide, clean near the cockpit. Terrence placed his backpack gently beneath the seat, sat down and folded his hands. His gaze stayed forward. He didn't take out his phone. He didn't look around, but a few people did look at him. A man in a gray blazer sitting in one. C frowned when he saw the uniform. He looked away quickly, but Terrence had already noticed. More passengers boarded. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse struggled with her carry-on. Terrence stood up, helped her lift it into the overhead bin, and returned to his seat without a word. She smiled at him faintly, but her eyes flicked to his uniform, then back to her purse. She didn't say thank you. She just sat down. Then came the sound of heels, sharp clicking. Quick, a woman stepped into the front cabin. Her posture stiff, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight twist. Her name tag read, Miss Danning. She was the lead flight attendant on this route, and she walked with the air of someone used to control. Her eyes moved row by row until they landed on Terrence. She stopped just like that. He didn't look at her, but he knew the pause. The stare, he had seen it before. Ms. Danning stepped forward slowly, voice loud enough for nearby passengers. "Sir, this seat is reserved for first class." Terrence turned his head slightly. "It is my seat, I don't think so," she said, her tone tightening. "Let me see your ticket." He reached into his jacket and calmly handed it over. She snatched it without thanks, scanned it with a brief glance, then narrowed her eyes. "This has to be a mistake," she muttered. "It's not," he said. Miss Danning didn't respond to that. She looked at him again, not at his ID or his name, but at him. Her voice rose. "You people always think you can get away with anything." Gasps didn't echo, but they were felt. A woman in seat 2. B stiffened. A man 3 rows back lowered his newspaper. Terrence didn't move. "Is there a problem?" And then she slapped him. Open palm loud across the face. He didn't react. For a second time seemed to stop. The man in 1C sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Someone whispered, "Did she just?" Terrence blinked once, then slowly rose to his feet. He didn't say a word. He bent down, picked up his backpack, and turned toward the cockpit. His face didn't show pain, anger, or confusion. Just focus. As he walked up the aisle, Miss Danning stood in place, stunned. She didn't expect that. She expected him to shout back to cause a scene to fit her idea of what he was. Instead, he walked straight to the cockpit door and knocked once. It opened immediately. Captain Rollins stood inside. When he saw who it was, he straightened. "Lieutenant Colonel Blake," he said, addressing him. "By rank, sir." Passengers in first class shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, others looked down. The air had changed, and it had only been 5 minutes. Captain Rollins stepped aside, allowing Terrence into the cockpit without hesitation. Inside, the co-pilot looked up, confused at first, then silently nodded in recognition. Terrence handed the captain a small encrypted case from his backpack. The captain opened it, inserted a key card, and read the brief message displayed on a secure tablet. His eyes widened slightly. He didn't ask any questions. He simply reached for the comm switch and said, "Ground control, hold our pushback. Repeat, hold our pushback. We have an FA level concern on board." In the cabin, the engine hum quieted. The plane, which had just been cleared to taxi, stopped moving. The seatbelt sign flicked off. A few passengers stirred in confusion. One man leaned toward the window. "We're not moving." The woman beside him checked her phone. Maybe there's a mechanical issue. Back in first class, Miss Danning had moved from the front galley. Her jaw was set, but she looked uneasy now. She reached for a water bottle, twisted the cap with shaking fingers, and took a sip. Her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. Something wasn't right. She hadn't been called in. No update from the captain. No word from the crew. The junior attendant, Brian, quietly approached her. He was new, but he had noticed everything. "Miss Danning," he said in a hushed voice. "Is everything okay?" She didn't look at him, just a delay. Probably traffic on the runway. He hesitated about earlier, the man in uniform. He wasn't supposed to be in that seat. She snapped quickly, but he had a ticket. Brian said carefully, "I saw the seat number. It matched." She glared at him, then softened her expression with forced calm. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Brian didn't respond. He just nodded and stepped away. In the cockpit, Captain Rollins finished his secure call with FAA command. His voice was tight when he turned to Terrence. "They've confirmed you're authorized to initiate a pause under Title VII. We are to remain grounded until further notice. FAA is dispatching a compliance officer to meet us on arrival. Full report required." Terrence gave a slow nod. "I'll return to my seat. If they ask, you can tell them the delay's on me." The captain gave a respectful glance. "Understood." Sir Terrence turned, stepped out of the cockpit and walked back into the stunned silence of the front cabin. He didn't look at Miss Danning as he passed. He didn't need to. Her face said everything: confusion, disbelief, and the first sting of fear. He sat down again in seat 1. He calmly folded his hands and looked forward. The plane wasn't going anywhere. And now everyone around him was starting to realize it. The passengers weren't sure what they were feeling, but it was no longer just confusion, it was tension. The kind that made people sit up straighter and glance at one another, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. The businessman in 1C looked over at Terrence, then quickly looked away. He had seen the slap, so had the woman in 2B, but no one had spoken. No one had moved. Miss Danning lingered at the galley, pretending to organize supplies. Her hand trembled slightly as she straightened napkins that were already perfectly aligned. She felt the shift too. It wasn't just about a delay now. Something had changed. The soldier hadn't shouted, hadn't resisted. He had gone forward, spoken to the captain, and now the entire aircraft was still. That quiet authority was something she hadn't expected, and it made her nervous. In the rear of the cabin, Brian whispered to another crew member. "As not just a passenger," he said under his breath. The captain saluted him, saluted the other attendant, repeated "Foolin'." Opened the cockpit door for him. No questions asked, they looked toward the front of the plane where Terrence sat motionless, his face calm, his uniform perfect, but his presence felt heavy now, not threatening, commanding. Suddenly, Miss Danning's name was called over the intercom, lead flight attendant to the cockpit. "Please." Her heart jumped. She took a deep breath and walked forward, smoothing her blouse as she moved. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she entered the cockpit, the door closed behind her with a quiet thud. The captain didn't look up right away. He waited a second, then turned to her slowly. "We've received a formal notice from FAA operations," he said. "They're aware of an incident involving a passenger in uniform, and you." Miss Danning's lips parted. "I was following procedure." He looked. The captain cut her off. "You struck him." She flinched. I reacted. "I thought he was." "Did you scan his ticket?" "I looked at it," she said quickly. "Did you verify it with the manifest?" "No," but the captain shook his head, his voice flat. "That man is a lieutenant colonel, has also on a compliance security clearance list. You put your hands on a federal officer, and now the FAA is grounding this flight until a full investigation takes place." Miss Danning's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. The headset on the control panel buzzed. The captain handed it to her. "This is Officer Daniels, FAA Enforcement Division," the voice said calmly. "We've been notified of a physical assault against an active duty officer on board, Flight 117. Are you the crew member involved?" Ms. Danning hesitated. "Yes, you are to escort the passenger back to his original seat immediately. You will deliver a clear verbal apology in front of witnesses, and you are not to speak with him again. After that, FAA agents will meet this flight upon landing. Do you understand? Her voice cracked. Yes, the line went dead. She slowly lowered the headset, her hands clammy. The captain said nothing more. She stepped out of the cockpit. Her feet felt unsteady. Everyone in the front cabin turned as she re-entered. And Terrence. He had moved an inch. Miss Danning stood at the front of the cabin, her hands trembling just enough to notice. She could feel the weight of every eye watching her, even the ones pretending not to look. Her throat felt tight, her thoughts scattered. For a moment she just stood there, frozen, then slowly began walking down the aisle toward seat 1. Her shoes no longer clicked with confidence. Her steps were quiet now, careful, almost unsure. Terrence sat still, eyes forward, hands folded, his face unreadable. He didn't flinch when she stopped beside him, didn't look up. The tension in the air was suffocating. Several passengers turned their heads, pretending to scroll their phones but clearly listening. One woman 2 rows back lowered her magazine without realizing it. A man in 3A nudged his wife gently. Even Brian, standing near the galley, leaned just slightly to the side to watch. I'd like to apologize. Miss Danning said, her voice dry. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about your seat. Her words were too rehearsed, too vague. Her tone didn't carry sincerity, just fear. Terrence looked up, his gaze calm but piercing. A misunderstanding, he repeated quietly. She nodded, eyes darting. Yes, about the boarding pass. You saw the seat number, he said plainly. And you still slapped me. Her breath caught. For a split second, the entire cabin felt like it had stopped breathing. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did, she replied, trying to stay composed. It was a mistaken judgment. A few heads turned more openly now. The man in 1C leaned back, visibly uncomfortable. He had seen it happen. So had others. No one had intervened. Terrence didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You looked at my face and decided I didn't belong here. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Miss Danning swallowed hard. Sorry, she said again, quieter this time. Say what you're sorry for, he said simply. She hesitated, her jaw tightened. The apology she was about to give wasn't one she had ever had to say in her life, and the truth of it cut deep. I assumed you didn't belong in first class, she said, barely audible. Because of how you looked. Silence. It wasn't just the apology that hurt. It was how familiar it sounded. How many times had passengers like Terrence been treated like they were out of place? Asked to explain themselves, prove themselves, earn a spot they already had. He gave a small nod, not of approval but acknowledgement. Thank you, he said. Now go do your job. Miss Danning turned without another word. Her face was flushed, and as she walked back up the aisle, she didn't lift her eyes to meet anyone else's. She just moved fast and nervous, disappearing into the galley like she could hide there. But she couldn't. Everyone had seen. Everyone had heard. And for the first time, she wasn't the authority. She was the one under the spotlight. Back in seat 1, Terrence didn't shift his posture. He didn't need to. The silence around him had changed. It no longer treated him like an outsider. It held weight now, the kind of weight that made people think twice before speaking. The kind that rewrote the unspoken rules about who's allowed to belong. The cabin remained unusually quiet. No one spoke, not loudly. The only sound was the faint rumble of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of crew members behind the curtain. But even that seemed to stop when the captain's voice broke in over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to delay our departure due to a compliance protocol. Thank you for your patience. We'll be underway as soon as we're cleared by ground control. That was all he said, but everyone knew now this wasn't just about a delay. This flight wasn't moving until a wrong had been faced in full view, and no one could unsee it. The minutes ticked by, but no one seemed to be watching the time anymore. The delay had stretched well past the usual explanations. Passengers who once checked their watches impatiently now sat strangely still, too aware of what was going on to pretend otherwise. The atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, not loud or angry, but sharp like the air before a storm. People didn't make eye contact for long. They fidgeted with their tray tables or tapped their screens without really scrolling. In seat 3, an older man with silver glasses finally leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "Did you see what she did to him?" His wife, a quiet woman in a cream cardigan, nodded without looking up. "She hit him," she said softly. "She didn't even ask a question first. I thought he was a general or something," the man added. The captain stood for him like he was the one running the flight. The woman finally looked at her husband. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice, and she slapped him like he was nothing. At the front of the plane, Terrence remained still in his seat. He hadn't touched his phone, hadn't moved since returning. His eyes stayed forward, but he was listening. He could hear the rustling, the whispers, the quiet discomfort spreading through the cabin like smoke. A few rows back, Brian peeked out from the galley, his face tense. He was holding a tray of water, but hadn't stepped forward. He was watching Miss Danning, who stood near the rear entrance now, half hidden behind the curtain, gripping the edge of a cabinet. Her face was pale, her jaw locked. She had taken that walk of apology, but it hadn't cleared the air. If anything, it had made the silence louder. Every step she took afterward was filled with a new kind of pressure. Not from superiors, but from the people she used to command. With a simple glare or order, Brian finally moved. He walked slowly up the aisle, stopping beside Terrence's seat. His voice was low, respectful. "Can I bring you anything, sir? Water, coffee?" Terrence shook his head politely. "Am fine, thank you." Brian nodded and moved on. He didn't rush. He didn't act like it was routine. There was a weight in his gesture that hadn't been there earlier, a kind of quiet recognition that couldn't be taught in any airline training. As Brian returned to the galley, he passed Miss Danning, who avoided his eyes. She was holding her phone now, pretending to scroll through notifications she didn't care about. Brian didn't stop, he didn't say a word, but as he passed her, she could feel the judgment in his silence. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rollins sat with his arms folded, the secure headset still active on the side panel. Another voice had joined the line, this one from FAA Enforcement Operations. "Confirm that the passenger has been returned to his seat," the voice said. "Confirmed," Rollins answered, "and the crew member has issued a public apology." There was a short pause, then understood. However, due to the nature of the incident and the passenger's clearance status, a compliance officer will be boarding the plane upon arrival. The crew member in question is to be escorted for immediate questioning. The captain sighed. "Understood. Maintain passenger log, record all interactions." This case is now elevated. When the call ended, the captain didn't speak. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the dim cabin lights through the cockpit window. He'd flown through thunder emergency landings, hydraulic failures. But he had never seen a flight halted for something like this. Not because of safety, not because of weather, but because of a slap. And what it revealed, he stood and opened the cockpit door again. Walking halfway down the aisle, he stopped near the galley and quietly motioned for Miss Danning to come forward. She hesitated. Now he said firmly. She walked toward him, her steps quick but unsteady. When she reached the cockpit door, he leaned in close and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "When we land, FAA officers will be waiting for you at the gate. You are not to speak to the passenger again. You are not to speak to anyone else. You'll be escorted off first." Her breath caught in her throat. "But I already apologized." He didn't blink. "This is no longer about an apology. This is now a federal compliance issue." She looked around as if hoping someone would step in for her, but there was no one. The curtain remained pulled back, passengers quiet in their seats, ears sharp. She stepped back, face drained of color. She returned to the rear galley, her footsteps no longer sharp but unsure. She sat down on the jump seat and stared at the wall, her uniform suddenly feeling like a costume she didn't deserve to wear. Meanwhile, Terrence shifted his gaze out the window, watching the airport crew slowly moving equipment beneath the wing. The plane hadn't moved in nearly 40 minutes, but he didn't mind. He wasn't in a rush. He had already done what needed to be done, not with a raised voice, not with force, just with truth and one quiet refusal to be invisible. Passengers began murmuring again, but the tone was different now. No longer restless or impatient, but uneasy. They weren't waiting for takeoff anymore. They were waiting for clarity. What had started as a routine flight now felt like a courtroom, and everyone on board had unknowingly been made a witness. Some looked out the window, others scrolled their phones, but no one could pretend they hadn't seen it anymore. Not after what had unfolded in full view. Terrence remained in his seat unmoving still. He had barely said more than 10 words since boarding, yet the air around him had changed, not because he tried to make it happen, but because the truth had a way of doing that on its own. His silence wasn't passive, it was powerful. It was making everyone else sit in their own silence and question what they'd done. Or had it back in 3C, a woman in a navy cardigan turned to the man beside her. "Do you think she's really going to get fired?" He adjusted his glasses. "I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised I saw the whole thing. She didn't just make a mistake." She struck him. The woman shook her head slowly and then tried to act like he didn't belong, until the captain called her in. Across the aisle, a young man who had been wearing earbuds since takeoff finally removed one and whispered to the couple beside him, "What's going on up there?" The older woman leaned in. She hit a soldier. He wasn't just any soldier, though. The captain stood for him, and now the FAA's involved. "No way," the young man muttered, glancing toward the front. "You mean this flight's grounded because of that, because of what she did?" The woman corrected. The whispers swelled like quiet waves. No yelling, no panic, just hushed conversations, filled with disbelief and something heavier, something closer to shame. In the rear galley, Miss Danning sat on the metal jump seat, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The flight attendant uniform that once gave her confidence now felt like a target. Her thoughts looped without pause the moment she slapped him, the look in his eyes, the captain's expression, the voice on the headset telling her she would be escorted off the plane. She hadn't lost control of the cabin. She had lost control of herself, and now she was facing the consequences. Brian stood nearby, wiping down the counter slowly. He hadn't spoken to her since the captain's announcement. When he finally did, his voice was low but clear. "They're really meeting us at the gate." She didn't look at him. "Yes," he nodded slowly, then said something she didn't expect. "You know we get complaints all the time, passengers being rude, causing trouble. But this isn't that. This wasn't a misunderstanding. You didn't even look at his boarding pass properly. You just looked at him," she clenched her jaw. "You don't know what I saw." "I know what I saw," he replied, wiping the same spot on the counter again, "and so does everyone else." Back up front, the captain sat quietly in the cockpit, the secure line now silent, but still active in case of further instructions. His co-pilot, a woman named Jenna, looked over. "This isn't going to blow over, is it?" He shook his head. "Not with the FAA involved. Not with who he is. You think it'll go public. Eventually, these things don't stay quiet for long. And from what I heard, he's not just military. He's cleared through federal aviation security. That puts this in a completely different category." Jenna exhaled. She didn't know she didn't care. The captain replied, "And now she'll have to." Outside, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside the gate. No airline logo, no food delivery truck, just government plates and two suited figures waiting by the terminal doors. One held a small folder, the other had a badge clipped to his jacket. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier by the minute. A woman in row 2 leaned forward and whispered toward the soldier. "Sir, I want to say, I'm sorry, I saw what happened. I didn't speak up and I should have." Terrence looked at her, not with anger, not even with judgment, just a quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, then leaned back into her seat. Eyes damp, people were beginning to feel it now. Not just the discomfort, but the weight of their silence. The realization that they had seen something wrong and sat still, that the comfort of staying quiet had turned into the guilt of complicity. Near the front, Brian stood beside the curtain, his eyes on the boarding door. He turned back to Terrence for a moment, and the two locked eyes. Brian gave a subtle nod, the kind of gesture that didn't need words. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines powered fully down. A moment later, the captain came back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin preparing for disembarkation shortly. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further instructions. A team will be meeting us at the gate." We appreciate your cooperation." No one clapped. No one sighed. They knew the woman who once held control over the entire cabin was about to be the first to leave, and not on her own terms. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had turned thick with silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes before takeoff, but the sharp kind that forces people to reflect on what they witnessed. It was the kind of silence that made people lower their phones, shift in their seats, and realize that something irreversible had happened. And it had happened while they watched. Terrence remained seated calm as ever. His back was straight, his boots flat on the floor, his backpack still tucked neatly beneath the seat. He hadn't moved in over an hour, not because he was waiting, because he didn't have to. Everything was already in motion. Around him, the first-class passengers sat straighter now, more aware but still quiet. They stole glances in his direction, but none of them could meet his eyes for long. Not after what they had let pass at the rear of the plane. Miss Danning still sat slouched on the jump seat, her eyes staring blankly at the emergency instruction label on the wall in front of her. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She had seen the SUV outside the window. She knew what it meant. She had worked in the airline for 12 years. She had trained others, enforced protocols, led emergency drills, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that would be remembered was a single slap and everything she said around it. Brian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes flicking back and forth between the cabin door and the seated passengers. He hadn't said another word to her. He didn't need to. His silence was deliberate, and it hurt more than if he'd yelled. She finally looked at him. "I've been here longer than you," she muttered. "I've seen worse happen. People yell, scream, push, and they get a warning." That's it. He didn't turn. None of them wore a uniform, her lips pressed together, her face flushing again. She wanted to explain herself, to say she was tired, stressed, misjudged a situation, anything. But she couldn't find a version of the story that made her look like anything other than what she had become in that moment. Someone who assumed a man didn't belong because of how he looked, and someone who struck him when he didn't agree. Near the front of the aircraft, the boarding door finally unlatched with a soft, metallic click. It was a small sound, but it echoed like thunder through the quiet cabin. Two figures stepped on board, a woman in a sharp black FAA uniform and a clean-cut man in a dark blue suit with a badge clipped to his belt. Neither of them wore a smile. Neither said a word. They walked with purpose past the first few rows, scanning the cabin slowly but deliberately. Passengers straightened up. A few reached for phones but quickly thought better of it. One man muttered, "That's federal," to his seatmate, who simply nodded in awe. The FAA officer stopped at the front row and looked down at Terrence Colonel Blake. She asked, her tone firm but respectful. He nodded once. "Yes, my name is Officer Rames. We're here on behalf of the Federal Aviation Authority and the Department of Aviation Oversight. We'll be escorting you off the aircraft last. Is that understood?" "Understood," he said plainly. The man beside her added, "We'll also be detaining a crew member for formal questioning. She will be removed first. We ask that you remain in your seat until the aircraft is cleared." Without another word, they turned and made their way toward the rear galley. Passengers twisted in their seats watching. All eyes were now on the back of the plane. No one pretended to be busy anymore. No one acted like this was just another delay. Miss Danning heard the footsteps before she saw the agents. Her whole body tensed. When they appeared in front of her, she stood up slowly, hands pressed to her sides, her mouth slightly open, like she wanted to ask a question but knew better. "Miss Danning, Officer Rames," said her voice steady. "You are to step off the aircraft now. You'll be escorted to a private room for immediate questioning, the former lead flight." Attendant nodded faintly, her lips pale. She turned toward Brian as if to say something, but he stepped aside without a word. That silence his, the passengers, the crews, was louder than anything she'd ever heard in a pressurized cabin. She walked up the aisle slowly, every step heavy. No one cheered. No one jeered. But everyone watched. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was quiet. Devastatingly quiet. The kind of quiet that sticks. As she passed row 1, she made the mistake of glancing at Terrence. He looked up, met her eyes once, not with hatred, not even anger, just quiet, firm disappointment, and somehow that was worse. Her gaze dropped. She kept walking. By the time she stepped off the plane, she had aged 10 years in her own mind. The air outside didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. And waiting just beyond the jet bridge was a table, a clipboard, and a government representative ready to write it all down. Back in the cabin, the door sealed again with a pressurized hiss. A few passengers finally exhaled. One man whispered, "That's the reason we never left the gate." A woman replied quietly, "She just ended her own career." Terrence didn't react. He reached down, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and leaned back slightly in his seat. The storm had passed, but only on the outside. Inside the aircraft, everyone now sat in the middle of something far bigger than a flight delay. They were sitting in the space between right and wrong, and they'd all seen what happened when someone made the wrong call. In the wrong moment to the wrong person, and that person didn't yell, he just made a call and grounded the plane. The cabin door remained closed, but the entire aircraft felt exposed, stripped of its usual hum of safety announcements and beverage carts. The plane had transformed into something unfamiliar, a place of quiet reckoning. Not a single passenger spoke above a whisper. Even the clink of an overhead bin being shut near the back caused heads to turn. The sense of normalcy had vanished the moment Miss Danning stepped off the plane, with the FAA agents at her side. Terrence remained seated in 1A, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze fixed on the wall ahead. He hadn't looked back once since the officer left with her. Not because he didn't care, but because this wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about punishing someone in front of an audience. It was about making the system pause long enough to notice what it had ignored for too long. Just a few rows behind a woman in her 30s, with a toddler on her lap, leaned forward slightly. She hadn't said a word during the entire incident, but now her voice was soft and clear. "I'm glad she's gone." Her husband beside her nodded slowly. That was hard to watch. She looked toward Terrence. And harder to admit, we didn't say anything. Passengers nearby caught fragments of the conversation. Nobody interrupted. Some sat with their arms crossed, uncomfortable. Others stared at their own reflections in the windows, lost in thought. The guilt in the air wasn't loud. It was quiet. Personal heavy. Brian walked back up the aisle slowly, not carrying anything this time. He paused at seat 1, keeping his voice low. "They'll be ready for you in a few minutes, sir," he said gently. "We're holding disembarkation until security gives the all clear." Terrence nodded once, understood. Brian hesitated, then added, "I wanted to say you handled that better than anyone I've ever seen." Terrence looked up at him. There was nothing to handle. "I had a seat." She chose to forget that Brian's eyes dropped for a second. "Still, thank you for staying calm." Terrence gave a quiet nod. That wasn't for her. It was for everyone else watching. Brian didn't reply. He just nodded back and walked away, this time slower, his shoulders carrying more than trays. Farther back in the plane, the woman who had earlier apologized to Terrence tapped her armrest nervously. She turned to her seatmate, a younger man in business attire, and whispered, "Do you think she really believed he didn't belong?" The man hesitated. "I think she didn't care if he did." "That's worse." Silence settled between them again. It was happening all over the aircraft, little pockets of realization. Some passengers tried to distract themselves. One man opened a laptop and stared blankly at the home screen. A college student nearby opened her notebook, then closed it again. No one could return to normal, because normal had just been challenged and it had lost. In the cockpit, Captain Rollins reviewed his latest directive from FAA headquarters. The officer who had escorted Miss Danning was now conducting an initial debrief in a holding room near the gate. Terrence was to remain on board until all passengers had left and a full flight report had been submitted. Every crew action had to be documented, every passenger statement collected if offered. It wasn't just an internal matter anymore. This was being logged as a priority-level compliance failure with grounds for federal disciplinary action. He set the headset down slowly and looked over at Jenna, the co-pilot. She was flipping through the logbook, but her hand had paused over the page. "This is going to change things," she said quietly. "It already has," Rollins replied. Back in the cabin, the seatbelt sign remained lit, though everyone could feel they were nearing the end. But it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a beginning. Something had cracked open, and the truth inside wasn't just about this one flight. It was about how easily someone could be silenced with a glance, a tone, a hand, and how easily everyone else could let it happen until someone didn't, until someone made one call. Terrence checked his watch. Not out of impatience, just awareness. The call had been made 64 minutes ago, and the plane still hadn't moved. Not an inch. The wheels hadn't turned, but something far bigger had. The silence, once a shield for power, had become a mirror, and the whole plane was being forced to look into it. No turbulence, no lightning, no broken engine. Just a man in uniform who refused to give up his seat. And now, the world was watching. The cabin lights flickered softly as the sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the rows of seats. The plane still hadn't moved. No pushback, no taxi. Just the sound of circulating air and the occasional shuffle of someone crossing their legs or adjusting a tray table. But no one complained. No one rang the call button. For once, silence wasn't awkward. It was deserved. In the first-class row, Terrence sat as steady as he had an hour ago. He had barely shifted. The seatbelt across his lap remained fastened. His phone lay screened down on the tray table untouched. He had nothing to prove to anyone. The proof was in the stillness of the cabin, the grounded wheels beneath the aircraft, and the subtle ripple of regret moving through the hearts of those around him. Just across the aisle, the businessman in 1C shifted again, uncomfortable not from the delay, but from something else entirely. His eyes darted toward Terrence, then back to his folded hands. He cleared his throat softly and leaned over. I saw what happened, he said barely above a whisper. Earlier, I just didn't know if it was my place to step in. Terrence didn't turn. He waited a moment before answering, his voice low but firm. It's always your place to stand up when something's wrong, especially when you're watching it happen. The man nodded slowly, then leaned back without another word. From further down the row, a teenager in a hoodie glanced over. He had earbuds in, but the music was paused. He'd been watching. Not just the incident, but the aftermath. How a man had absorbed a blow, stayed composed, and still controlled the entire cabin without raising his voice. He didn't say anything out loud, but something settled in his eyes, a quiet lesson he wouldn't forget. Meanwhile, the flight attendants had returned to their stations, performing necessary checks with more caution than usual. Even the newer crew members, normally chatty or distracted, moved with deliberate quiet. Miss Danning's absence weighed on them, not just as a staffing gap, but as a symbol of what had shifted in the sky that day. A reminder that uniforms alone don't grant authority, and silence is no longer a shield. Brian emerged from the galley again, this time with a checklist in hand. As he approached each row, he offered soft smiles, short nods, small gestures to assure passengers the crew was still present, still watching, still capable. When he reached Terrence's seat, he hesitated. I've got to check in with everyone up front, he said quietly. But I want to say something before we land. Terrence raised an eyebrow slightly. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't escalate anything. You could have. Most people would have. But you didn't. Brian looked around the cabin, then back at him. That did more than shouting ever could. Terrence nodded once. Sometimes silence says exactly what people don't want to hear. Brian smiled faintly and moved on the clipboard, trembling just a little in his hand. At the rear of the aircraft, a woman stood up from row 28 to use the lavatory. On her way forward, she passed Terrence's row and paused. She didn't know his name. She hadn't seen the slap, but she had heard enough whispers to know what had happened. She looked at him briefly, eyes uncertain, then lowered her gaze and continued to the restroom. But something in her walk had changed, slower, more aware. Even passengers who hadn't seen the incident directly could feel the shift. It was no longer about the seat or the uniform. It was about something deeper: permission to belong, permission to sit without explanation, and permission long denied to many to be treated as an equal the moment they stepped on board. No questions, no assumptions, no doubt. Outside the aircraft, the SUV was gone. In its place stood a new pair of officials, one from the airline's internal investigations team, the other from the FAA's compliance division. Both held clipboards, Both were reviewing notes from the cockpit, call, the cabin logs, and passenger seating charts. The airline had made it clear this incident was to be fully documented, addressed, and most importantly, not repeated. Inside, the captain's voice came back over the speaker this time. Slower, more measured. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our disembarkation shortly. For procedural reasons, please remain seated until your row is called. We appreciate your patience. No one moved. They were used to standard instructions, but this one felt different. More official, more final. And then after a moment of pause, something unusual happened. A woman in business class, well-dressed, confident, looking, stood and turned toward Terrence's row. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply said thank you. Terrence met her eyes briefly, then gave a slight nod. That was all, but the ripple it sent through the cabin was unmistakable. A man in row 5 said, "You changed the way I see things." Another in row 6 added, "You didn't just hold your seat, you held your ground." Terrence didn't answer them all. He didn't have to. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen after the storm, when the people who watch silently begin to find their voices again. The plane was still grounded, but the truth, it had already taken flight. The cabin remained still, though the tension had shifted into something else. Not anxiety, but accountability. People who had boarded the plane thinking it was just another flight were now sitting in the middle of a story they hadn't expected to be part of. And even if they didn't say it aloud, they knew they would carry it off the plane. A few rows back, a mother with 2 school-age boys sat in silence. One of the boys leaned toward her and whispered, "Why did she hit him?" The mother didn't answer right away. She looked toward the front, where Terrence still sat upright, composed, silent. Because she thought she could, she finally said. The boy furrowed his brow, but he didn't do anything. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet. "That's why it matters not far from them." A young woman opened her phone and started typing a message she hadn't planned to write. "I saw a soldier get slapped today. He didn't yell, he didn't push back. He made a call and the whole plane froze. FAA agents delay all of it. But what shook me the most, no one stood up when it happened. Not one of us." She stared at the screen for a long time, then hit send. Back in first class, Terrence remained composed. He had felt this weight before. Not the weight of fear, but of silence. He'd seen it in waiting rooms, board meetings, training bases, and now in an aircraft where he held a valid ticket, wore a visible badge, and still had to prove he belonged. But today was different, because today the silence had shifted. It was no longer working against him. It was working for him. Across the aisle, the businessman who had earlier confessed his inaction opened his briefcase and removed a notebook. He wrote a single sentence in the corner of a page. "Don't wait for someone else to speak." He underlined it once and closed the notebook with a slow breath. No one told him to write that. No memo, no training manual. Just a moment he couldn't forget. Near the back, Brian leaned against the galley wall. Arms folded, his eyes locked on the cabin. The checklist was complete, but he hadn't filed it yet. Something inside him felt different, not broken, but stirred. He had watched his senior officer fall apart in less than 2 hours. Not because of equipment failure or a passenger outburst, but because of her own choice. A single moment of judgment had unraveled her years of control. And now he understood authority didn't come from a name tag or seniority. It came from how you treated the people. No one expected you to respect. The flight was nearly ready to disembark. Security staff waited just beyond the terminal doors. The captain had already received the final confirmation. Terrence was to exit, last escorted only by protocol, not by force. Before any passengers were released, Captain Rollins stepped out into the aisle one final time. His presence was calm, but not casual. He stood beside row 1 and faced the cabin. "I want to thank you all for your patience during this delay." He said, his voice firm and measured. "I also want to acknowledge that what occurred on this flight was not typical and should never have happened." The passengers listened. No one looked at their phones. He continued, "We are responsible not just for safety, but for dignity, for every seat, for every person. This delay wasn't caused by weather or mechanical failure. It was caused by a failure of respect, and today that will be recorded, not ignored." Silence followed, but not the uncomfortable kind. This silence carried meaning. The captain nodded, turned and returned to the cockpit without another word. Brian stood near the front curtain waiting for the signal to begin offboarding. When the overhead light blinked, he stepped forward. "Well, begin disembarking by row," he announced gently. "Please remain seated until your row is called one by one." The passengers began to rise slower than usual, more deliberate. The shuffle of bags from Mabanshumi. Under seats, the soft clicks of belts being unbuckled. But none of the usual urgency. No pushing, no complaints, just quiet order. As rows emptied, some passengers passed Terrence and nodded. Others avoided eye contact. A few paused but said nothing. The weight of what they hadn't done still lingering. An older man, thin and gray-haired, stepped past and whispered, "I served too. Sorry you had to deal with this." Terrence nodded once without looking up. He didn't need the validation, but the acknowledgement mattered. Soon the plane was nearly empty. Only a few crew remained, plus the compliance officer waiting near the door. Brian returned to the first-class cabin and stood near Terrence's seat. "They're ready for you now, sir," he said softly. Terrence looked up. His expression hadn't changed. Calm, focused, unshaken. He stood slowly, picked up his backpack, and straightened his uniform. As he walked up the aisle, every pair of eyes that remained followed him, not out of curiosity now, but out of awareness. The kind that stays. And when he stepped off that plane, he didn't just carry his rank. He carried the truth and left behind a cabin full of people who would never board the same way again. The terminal lights were harsh after the dim cabin glow, but Terrence's steps didn't falter. His boots moved with the same quiet precision as when he boarded. No rush, no hesitation. On either side of the jet bridge, uniformed staff stood in still rows. Some were from the airline, others wore FAA jackets. No one spoke. No one tried to stop him. They just stepped aside, giving him space not out of fear, but respect. At the end of the jet bridge, Officer Rames waited with a clipboard, her face composed. Behind her, a tall man in a dark suit glanced at Terrence and gave a small formal nod. "Colonel Blake," she said, not a question, but a statement of identity. "You'll be escorted to the VIP debrief area." "This is purely procedural, understood," Terrence replied. "Before that, would you like to make a statement?" Terrence paused. He looked at the terminal behind her. The crowds walking past, the rolling bags, the blinking flight boards showing updates for cities far away. Then he turned his eyes back to Rames. "I didn't come here to teach anyone a lesson," he said quietly. "I just came to sit in my assigned seat." Rames studied him for a second, then nodded. Noted with that Terrence was led down a private corridor, away from the noise, away from the gawking passengers lingering behind glass walls. Some recognized him now. Word had spread fast. A few people tried to snap photos, but security gently blocked their view. Others whispered among themselves, but none dared speak directly to him, because deep down everyone knew this wasn't a media moment. It was a mirror, and nobody wanted to see themselves in what had happened on that plane. Inside the terminal's private security room, Ms. Danning sat stiffly at a metal table. Her uniform jacket had been removed. Her hands were folded tightly on the tabletop, her knuckles white. A bottle of water sat unopened. Beside her, she hadn't spoken in nearly 10 minutes. Across from her sat a representative from the airline's compliance department, his face unreadable, a legal pad in front of him. "For the record," he began again, "you confirm that you approached the passenger in seat 1A without a directive from the crew manifest or any report from another flight member?" "Yes," she muttered. "And your reason for approaching him was?" She hesitated. Her throat moved like she was swallowing something sharp. "I didn't recognize him. I assumed he wasn't supposed to be there." "Did he show you a boarding pass?" "Yes." "Did you scan it?" "No." The official leaned forward slightly. "What about him? Made you think he didn't belong?" She froze. The question hovered in the air. "You understand," he continued slowly. "This is what the FAA is asking. This is what the airline must account for. What exactly did you see or think you saw that made you ignore protocol, bypass ID verification, and physically strike a passenger in uniform?" Her voice cracked. He didn't look like someone who flew first class. Silence followed, the pen in the official's hand moved slowly across the paper. "Thank you," he said flatly. She wanted to defend herself, to explain. But every excuse she had rehearsed crumbled under the truth of what she'd just admitted. Across the airport in a glass-walled conference room, executives from the airline had gathered around a speakerphone. Legal teams, public relations managers, and department heads all sat in tight, straight rows, the silence broken only by the occasional shuffle of paper. On the screen in front of them, a paused security video from the gate. It showed Miss Danning confronting Terrence. No audio, just body language, her arm raised, his head recoiling. This footage, one executive said, is going to be part of every training session from now on. The head of PR spoke next. The press is already calling. We've got social media chatter, hashtags forming. The FAA is confirming they were involved. We either address this now or lose the narrative. The CEO, a gray-haired man in a navy tie, looked toward the footage again. Release a statement, apologize publicly, make it clear we're cooperating with the FAA, but don't just talk, implement. A legal advisor leaned in. We have to suspend her immediately. Termination proceedings will follow. She violated at least 5 conduct protocols and federal discrimination guidelines. The CEO nodded. Do it, in him. Another asked. The room fell quiet again. Send him a formal apology. The CEO said, no, not just a letter. Contact the Pentagon. We want to issue that apology through the channels he answers to. Not as a favor, as accountability. At that moment, back in the VIP area, Terrence sat in a quiet lounge sipping a bottle of water, his backpack beside him. He hadn't asked for special treatment. He hadn't demanded compensation or press. He had asked for one thing: to be treated like he belonged in the seat he was assigned. And when that was denied, he had acted not out of emotion, but out of principle. A young staff member entered the room carefully. Colonel Blake, she said, we've just been told that the CEO of the airline will be reaching out directly. They're preparing an apology. Terrence raised an eyebrow slightly. To me? Yes, sir. He looked at her, then back at the water in his hand. Let them keep it, he said. Tell them to change the policy. That's the only apology that matters. The staff member nodded, her voice quiet. He'll let them know. As she left the room, Terrence leaned back in the chair. He had flown dozens of missions, sat through briefings in rooms far more intense than this one, but this moment felt heavier in a different way, because this wasn't about a battlefield. This was about something quieter, something that wore a smile while questioning your right to be where you already belonged. And he knew, even without turning on the news, that what had happened on Flight 263 would echo far beyond that gate. In classrooms, in boardrooms, in training videos, and conversations between strangers, not because of what was shouted, but because of what wasn't. The slap had stopped a moment. His silence had stopped a plane. And now nothing was taking off until the truth was accounted for. By the following morning, the story had already taken flight, and this time, it wasn't the plane. A quiet article appeared first on an independent aviation blog, headlined "Flight Delayed by FAA After Incident Involving First-Class Passenger and Uniformed Officer." The post was short, almost clinical, but tucked near the middle was a single jarring sentence. Sources confirmed the passenger was a black military officer removed from his assigned seat by a senior flight attendant without verification. The article spread fast. It reached larger outlets by midday. Within hours, national news stations began reaching out to the airlines. Communications team and local reporters showed up at the airport, cameras in hand. But what caught public attention wasn't just the headlines, it was the footage. A passenger seated in row 4 had recorded a short, silent video. Terrence calm and still in his seat while 2 FAA officials boarded the plane and removed the flight attendant in uniform. The video didn't capture the slap it didn't need to. The image of a soldier being silently acknowledged while his aggressor was escorted off said everything. The clip lasted only 18 seconds, but it exploded online. No music, no narration, just silence and shame. The comments came fast. He didn't yell, he didn't shout, and yet he grounded the plane. You know how powerful you have to be to stop a flight without saying a word? She didn't question his seat. She questioned his presence. People weren't just reacting, they were reckoning. In offices and classrooms and texts and lunchrooms, people started asking the same question. Would I have spoken up if I had been there? The answer for most was deeply uncomfortable. and that discomfort traveled fast. The airline, under intense pressure, issued a formal public apology by late afternoon, but this wasn't the usual template. The BAI statement began with a clear admission. A decorated officer was humiliated on one of our flights. This should not have happened. We take full responsibility. They followed with action, announcing an overhaul of crew training, immediate termination of the flight attendant involved, and a new passenger rights policy specifically created to protect travelers against arbitrary seat challenges, especially those involving minors, veterans, or visible minority groups. The FAA, in an unusual move, confirmed its own investigation publicly. A spokesperson addressed the press. "We are treating this incident not as a disciplinary footnote, but as a systemic warning. Compliance doesn't stop at safety equipment, it extends to dignity." Meanwhile, far from the noise, Terrence sat quietly at his hotel room desk, watching the morning coverage with the volume turned low. The room was modest, a government lodging used often by federal employees in transit. A simple chair, a desk, a window with an airport view. He had checked in quietly the night before. No fanfare, no escort. His phone buzzed again. Another text, another message, another request for an interview. He ignored them all. He hadn't done this for recognition. He didn't want to be the face of a viral headline. He hadn't set out to expose anything. All he wanted was to sit in his assigned seat and arrive at his destination with dignity intact. There was a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, a woman in civilian dress stood holding a manila envelope. "Colonel Blake," she asked. He nodded. "I've been asked to deliver this on behalf of the airline's executive office. There's a letter inside. Also confirmation of their full policy change and a request for you to join a private board to advise on future training programs." Terrence took the envelope silently. "I'm just the messenger," she said before stepping back and disappearing down the hall. He closed the door and placed the envelope on the table without opening it. He didn't need a letter to tell him something had changed. Across the country, in a classroom outside Denver, a teacher stood at the front of a high school ethics class holding a printed article in her hand. She began with one line: "Today we're discussing what happens when silence becomes a stand." On the screen behind her, the headline glowed, "Flight grounded by one man's." Quiet refusal, back at the airport where it all started. The crew schedule for the week was being restructured. Every flight attendant assigned to that route was now required to attend a mandatory session titled Bias, Power, and Passenger Rights. The first slide of the presentation displayed a still image from the flight video. Terrence seated with calm on his face and silence in his hands, a silence that changed everything. In the break room, Brian sat with a cup of coffee, staring at the printed memo pinned to the corkboard. Other crew members gathered around, reading, some nodding, others staying quiet. "You worked that flight right?" one of them asked. He nodded. "What was he like?" Brian thought for a moment, then answered. Still like he knew he didn't need to fight because the truth was loud enough. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Because everyone there knew the real turbulence wasn't in the air that day. It was on the ground in how people are treated, seen, or dismissed. And one man had forced the whole system to stop mid-runway and face it. Without shouting, without threats, just by refusing to move. 3 days later, Terrence was back home, not at a base, not in a hotel, but in a quiet 2-story house on the edge of a small town where the neighbors waved from their porches, and the coffee shop still knew how he liked his order. He had returned the way he left, unannounced, low profile, unbothered by the headlines still circling the country. His front door creaked open just before noon. The first thing he noticed was the envelope still untouched in his duffel bag. He had meant to toss it, maybe even burn it. But for some reason, he left it there. Maybe one day he'd want to show someone what a forced apology looked like when the system realized it could no longer hide behind policy. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and walked into the living room. The television was off. The silence this time was comforting. No passengers, no cabin noise, no assumptions waiting behind every glance. He sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the blank wall for a moment. It had been 3 days and still not a single person from that flight had reached out to him directly, except one. At exactly 6:47 a.m. that morning, a handwritten letter had arrived in the mail. It was from the woman in row 12. Her name was June Bailey, He remembered her short gray curls, sensible shoes, kind eyes. She had said nothing on the flight, but her eyes had said enough. Now her words were on paper in shaky cursive. Dear Colonel Blake, I was on your flight last week. I didn't speak up when I should have. I sat there and watched someone treat you like you didn't belong, even though you clearly did. I want to tell you that I'm sorry, not just for myself, but for my silence, which allowed that moment to stretch far longer than it should have. Your calm, your stillness, it did something to me. I've been a nurse for 42 years. I've seen people act from panic, from fear, from anger, but I've never seen someone change a room by simply not reacting. You changed that entire plane without raising your voice. That's not weakness, that's control. And that control taught me more than any diversity seminar ever has. Thank you for holding your ground, even when none of us held it with you. With respect, June Bailey. Terrence read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside a drawer right next to a worn photo of his father in uniform. The kind of man who always told him, you don't have to shout to make a point, but if the system won't listen, stop the system. Later that evening, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the media, it was the Department of Defense. An internal request had been made. Would Colonel Terrence Blake be willing to lead a new interagency training module for active duty personnel on handling public confrontation with grace authority and psychological restraint? He stared at the message. Handling public confrontation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The military wanted him to teach people how to do what he had done. Sit down, stay quiet, and still shut down an entire operation without lifting a finger. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped outside onto the porch, letting the cool evening air settle around him. The wind carried a distant hum of traffic. Somewhere a dog barked, and beneath it all, there was peace. The kind of peace that only comes after truth has been seen, not just heard. Across the street, his neighbor, Mr. Ellison, an older white man with a veteran's hat and a cane, raised a hand in a small salute. Terrence returned the gesture with a nod. The world hadn't changed overnight. Airports would still be tense. People would still judge without knowing. But something had cracked, something quiet, invisible and long overdue. And that was enough. He looked down at his phone again and typed out a reply. Yes, it'll do it, but only if civilians can attend too. Because what happened on that plane wasn't just a military lesson. It was a human one, and it had grounded more than just a flight. It had grounded assumptions, systems power that had long gone unchecked. And from the stillness of that moment, something finally began to move in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from Flight 263 continued to ripple through every corner of the aviation industry and far beyond it. The airline's revised policy manual was rolled out publicly with bolded headlines that hadn't existed in earlier versions: passenger rights, regardless of appearance. Authority limits of cabin crew and protocol for conflict. Without bias, major news outlets praised the clarity and transparency. Civil rights organizations cautiously applauded the step forward. But with a consistent reminder, this change came too late for too many. Terrence, meanwhile, kept a low profile. He declined all television interviews, podcast appearances, and feature articles. He didn't want to be turned into a symbol. He wanted the system to feel uncomfortable, not celebrated. For him, the entire ordeal had never been about exposure. It had been about Principle A. Man in uniform had been stripped of dignity in public, and rather than cause chaos, he had let the silence carry the weight. That silence, ironically, had said far more than any viral quote could. Still, the request poured in. Universities invited him to speak on racial dynamics and institutional systems. Government agencies wanted his insight on calm resistance in crisis response. And airline unions even reluctantly asked for his input on how to better train crew in recognizing the difference between authority and entitlement. One invitation came from a place he hadn't expected: a private flight academy in Arizona that specialized in training first-generation pilots. The founder, a black woman named Marlene Young, had written to him personally. "We teach people to fly planes, but now we need to teach them how to fly with integrity. Would you be willing to speak to our incoming class?" Terrence agreed. When he arrived, he was greeted by students who weren't dressed in uniforms. Yet most wore jeans, sneakers, and nervous ambition. Many of them had seen the video from the plane. Some had memorized it like scripture. Not for the drama, but for the stillness. That moment had shown them what they feared. That even when you wear the badge, sit in the right seat, and follow every rule, you could still be told you didn't belong. But it also showed them what was possible, that when challenged, you could hold your ground without becoming what they expected. He walked into the room without a speech. He stood in front of the classroom and looked each student in the eye. And then he said, "On that flight, I had every right to stand up. I had every reason to respond with fire. But I knew if I did, they'd stop seeing me as a man and start seeing me as a threat. So I stayed still. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted the system to reveal itself." The room was silent. Some students took notes. Others just stared, locked in. You will fly planes, you will wear uniforms, and some of you, maybe many of you, will still be questioned. Because to them, you might always look like a mistake sitting in the right seat. He paused. Let that truth settle. But if you ever find yourself in that moment where everything in you wants to shout, prove, or fight, I want you to remember something. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. One student, a young man with a scar on his chin, raised his hand. But what if they don't listen to silence? Terrence didn't hesitate. Then you let the consequences do the speaking. That line stayed with them. It echoed in their notebooks. It made its way into classroom discussions, lunch conversations, and even future simulator sessions. That visit led to more sessions. More quiet classrooms filled with students who'd never met him, but felt like they had. And while all this was happening, another shift was taking place. The airline industry, long plagued by reports of bias, profiling, and abuse of authority, found itself under a brighter light. Customers began filming more, not just for viral moments, but as a form of protection. Passengers knew the name Terrence Blake now, and flight attendants. They knew that what had once been brushed off as instinct could now end a career in minutes. Back at home, Terrence still kept the letter from June. Bailey in his drawer, he didn't look at it often. He didn't need to. That letter wasn't a reminder of pain. It was proof that moments like his weren't wasted when they planted something in someone else. Every now and then, neighbors would stop him in the grocery store. "You were the guy, right? From that plane," head nod. "Man, that was something. You did good." He never lingered on the praise, just nodded, paid for his things, and moved on, because he knew better than anyone this wasn't about being a hero. It was about holding your place in a world that tries to shrink you and staying seated even when every system wants you gone. And when people asked him later, how did it feel to stop a plane without raising your voice? He always said the same thing: I didn't stop the plane. They did. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it happening. Months passed and the media storm eventually faded. New headlines came. New controversies grabbed attention. The footage from Flight 263 wasn't trending anymore. But what remained in airports, in staff meetings, in classrooms, and in quiet minds was the memory of what that flight had exposed. Not just about a single crew member, but about a system that allowed silent bias to ride first class. Yet for Terrence, Blake, life had quietly returned to its usual rhythm. He resumed his post, rotated through his assignments, mentored junior officers, and remained as composed as ever. But every so often, someone would recognize him. Not because of his uniform, not even because of the video, but because of the way he carried himself. Still grounded. Watchful. One evening, while speaking at a private leadership event for military-civilian collaboration, a young officer asked him during the QA, "Sir, if you could go back, would you do anything differently on that flight?" The room fell silent again. Terrence leaned forward slightly. "Yes," he said calmly. That answer surprised people. "I would have asked the passengers sitting next to me to speak up. Not because I needed defending, but because the real test was in what she did. It was what they did." The officer nodded, understanding. Others wrote it down afterward. A retired general approached him backstage. "You know you're going to be remembered for that flight, like it or not." Terrence gave a faint smile. He'd rather be remembered for what changed after it, and slowly things were changing. In a corner of a flight school in Michigan, a new mural had been painted in the student commons. It showed a plane grounded on a runway, but with its shadow rising like a bird into the clouds. At the bottom of the mural were just 4 words. He sat, we stood. The artist, a 19-year-old aviation student, said she painted it because she never wanted her classmates to forget that silence, when wielded with purpose, could shift the entire altitude of power. In airports across the country, posters had begun appearing in employee areas, visual reminders of passenger rights, respectful conflict resolution, and a new phrase now embedded in corporate training. Uniforms don't determine truth. Actions do. At one major airline conference in Atlanta, a senior executive opened her keynote speech with a reference to Flight 263. She didn't name names. She didn't sensationalize. She simply said, "We lost altitude that day, not because of turbulence, but because of ego. We will never let that happen again." Terrence never responded to it. He didn't need to. But perhaps the most unexpected ripple came from someone no one had expected to hear from again. Ms. Danning, 6 months after the incident, she submitted a letter not to the press, not to social media, but directly to the airline's internal employee forum. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was handwritten, scanned, and quietly shared in a digital newsletter. Her words were brief. "I saw him sitting in that seat and something in me reacted. I didn't ask questions. I assumed I acted. And I was wrong. I lost my job that day, but more importantly, I was forced to face what I had been carrying for years. The fear of losing control, the belief that authority had to be loud, and the lie that professionalism was about knowing who belonged. That man didn't shout. He didn't insult me. He didn't even move. But he revealed everything I needed to see about myself. No one applauded her. But some read the letter and paused. Because the truth is, accountability doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like reflection, like a door quietly opening where shame once stood. As for Terrence, the story of that day had been written and rewritten, turned into reports, speeches, and PowerPoint slides. But for him, it remained personal, not because of what the world saw, but because of what it did. He remembered the silence on that plane. He remembered the boy asking his mother, why did she hit him? He remembered the woman in row 12, the one who sent the letter. And he remembered every pair of eyes that looked away when it mattered most, and then looked back once they realized they had missed something they couldn't unsee. He often thought about the seat he'd been told to leave. Seat 1A. He hadn't picked it for status. He picked it because it had the clearest view of the sky, and when he finally sat there, when everything told him he wasn't supposed to, he held his place. Not out of pride, but out of truth. Because sometimes the most powerful act isn't fighting your way into a space. It's staying still when they try to push you out. That day a plane was grounded, but what truly stopped midair was the lie that respect must be earned by proving you belong. He already belonged. He always did. And from that moment forward, so would everyone else who dared to sit quietly, rightfully in their seat. This wasn't just a story about a soldier being disrespected. It was about quiet strength, dignity, and how one man's silence shook an entire system. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories like this one.